The wind spoke first. It began as a low whisper across the endless plains of western Nebraska, a mournful sigh that rustled the brittle, sleeping grasses of late autumn. Inside the strangest home for 100 miles, Silas Blackwood paused, a tin cup of coffee halfway to his lips, and listened. The sound was changing, deepening from a sigh to a low, guttural moan that vibrated through the very ground. He glanced at the walls of his small cabin, not built of rough-hewn logs or desperate prairie sod, but of massive, compressed bales of slough grass, stacked like giant golden bricks. Their faint, sweet scent, a memory of summer, filled the quiet air, a stark contrast to the growing menace outside. Across the small table, his wife, Alara, looked up from her mending, her needle held motionless. Her eyes, the color of the prairie sky in August, met his. No fear resided there, only a deep, shared understanding. They had chosen this path together, a path paved with the ridicule of their neighbors and the quiet scorn of every sensible man in the territory. They called his creation Blackwood's Folly, or, more cruelly, the Tinderbox House. The laughter in the nearby town of Providence had been a constant, stinging presence all through the long months of its construction. Silas placed his cup down, the clink of metal on the simple plank table the only sharp sound in the insulated quiet. The silence within their hay bale walls was profound, an almost living thing that muffled the world. But now the rising howl of the wind began to intrude, a predator circling their fragile sanctuary. They didn't know then that this was no ordinary winter squall. This was the breath of an Arctic leviathan, a blizzard that would be spoken of in hushed, reverent tones for the next 75 years. They had weathered the town's scorn and their own private doubts, but the true test, the one whispered on the wind itself, was only now beginning. It had all started the spring before, with a problem as old as the plains themselves, the scarcity of trees. Silas had staked his claim on a quarter section of prime ranching land, a vast, rolling ocean of grass that promised a future for a man willing to work. But the land, generous with fodder, was miserly with timber. The nearest cottonwood groves were a day's ride away down in the Platte River Valley, and the wood was soft, prone to rot, and jealously guarded by those who had settled there first. To build a proper log house, the kind a man could be proud of, would mean hauling expensive pine lumber by wagon from the railhead 60 miles east. The cost was staggering, an impossible sum for a young rancher who had sunk every last dollar into his breeding stock of Hereford cattle. Their first year had been spent in a cramped, damp sod dugout carved into the side of a low hill. It was a burrow, not a home. It wept muddy tears in the rain and was perpetually dim, smelling of earth and mice. The previous winter had been a brutal education. The wind, with nothing to break its stride for 1,000 miles, had ripped across their land with a saw-toothed edge, driving snow into every crack of their hovel, and freezing 2 of their best heifers where they stood, huddled against a fence line that offered no real protection. The memory was a cold stone in Silas's gut. He had sat with Alara through those long, frigid nights, the thin walls of their dugout offering little comfort, listening to the keening wind and feeling their resolve slowly being eroded by the sheer, indifferent power of the Nebraskan winter. He was a practical man, a student of the land, and he knew they could not endure another season like that. Their dream, so vibrant under the summer sun, felt brittle and fragile in the face of that cold. "We can't afford the lumber, Silas," Alara had said one evening, her voice quiet but firm, stating a fact that hung between them like the frost on their window pane. "And I won't spend another winter in this hole in the ground. It's no place to raise a family." Her words weren't an accusation. They were a simple, heartbreaking truth that solidified his desperation into a new kind of determination. He had to find another way. The land had to offer its own solution. The answer did not arrive in a flash of divine inspiration. It came slowly, quietly, revealing itself in the simple, observable truths of the prairie. One afternoon during a late spring cold snap, a biting north wind descended unexpectedly. Silas was out checking on his herd when he saw them clustered together on the leeward side of a massive haystack he had built the previous autumn, a leftover mound of densely packed slough grass. The cattle were calm, placidly chewing their cud, their bodies shielded from the relentless gale. The wind whipped past the stack, its force broken, its icy breath diverted. Snow flurries began to fall, and Silas watched, fascinated, as the flakes piled up in a deep drift against the hay wall, creating an even greater barrier. He walked over to the stack, plunging his bare hand deep into the tightly bound grass. Just inches in, the chill of the wind vanished, replaced by a surprising dry warmth, the stored heat of the earth and the insulating power of 1,000,000 hollow stems. He stood there for a long time, the wind tearing at his coat, his hand buried in the heart of the haystack. It was an idea so simple, so elemental, that he almost dismissed it. Building a house of grass seemed like a child's fantasy. Yet the evidence was undeniable. The best insulation on the entire property wasn't wood or earth, but the very crop he harvested for his animals. That evening he tried to explain it to Alara, sketching his thoughts in the dirt floor of their dugout with a stick. He drew a rectangle for the foundation, then stacked squares upon it. "What if we built with that?" he asked, his voice full of a cautious excitement he hadn't felt in months. "With the hay itself, baled tight, stacked like stones." Ilara stared at the crude drawing, her brow furrowed. She felt the surface of a loose bale near their doorway, her fingers testing its density. She saw the logic in it, the strange organic wisdom that was so characteristic of her husband. A slow smile spread across her face, chasing the worry from her eyes. "They call us sod busters," she said, a new strength in her voice. "Why not hay builders? If it keeps the cattle warm, it'll keep us warm." In that moment, her faith became the foundation upon which every bale would eventually rest. The work began under the long, hot sun of early summer, and with it came the ridicule. Silas first constructed a heavy baling press, a contraption of levers and wood that allowed him to compress the tough prairie grass into dense, uniform blocks, each weighing nearly 200 pounds. He laid a stone foundation, painstakingly hauling the rock from a dry creek bed 2 miles away. Then the walls began to rise. At first, passing riders would simply slow their horses, staring in silent confusion at the sight of a man building a house from the same material he fed his livestock. Confusion soon curdled into open mockery. The town of Providence, a dusty collection of wooden storefronts and sober-minded folk, became a hive of gossip about the mad rancher Silas Blackwood. Old man Hemlock, who ran the general store and considered himself the arbiter of all practical matters, rode out himself to dispense his wisdom. "Silas," he began, spitting a stream of tobacco juice near the foundation, "a man's home is his castle. It's a legacy. You can't build a legacy out of cow fodder. One stray spark, one bolt of lightning, and your wife's a widow." Silas didn't stop his work. He just kept hefting the heavy bales, his muscles straining, his face set in a determined mask. "It won't burn, Mr. Hemlock," he stated calmly, not bothering to look up. "Going to plaster it inside and out with clay and lime, thick as a brick." Hemlock just shook his head, muttering about fools and their follies as he rode away. The story spread, embellished with each telling. Children would ride their ponies to the edge of his property and shout names. "Hay house! Hay house! Huffs and puffs and blows it down!" they'd shriek before galloping away, their laughter carried on the wind. Ilara bore the shunning in town with quiet dignity, her chin held high as she endured the whispers and pitying looks at the mercantile. Their isolation was complete, fencing them off from the community more effectively than any barbed wire. But instead of breaking them, the scorn forged their bond into something stronger than steel. It was them against the world, and their strange, golden-walled house was their fortress. "Let them laugh," Elara would say at night, rubbing the ache from his shoulders. "They're not the ones who'll have to live through the winter. We will, and we'll be warm." The construction was a testament to methodical ingenuity. It was not the desperate act of a fool, but the calculated work of an engineer without a title. After setting a sturdy, minimalist timber frame, acquired through a trade of his two best colts, Silas began to lay the bales like a stonemason, staggering the joints for strength. Each bale was impaled on sharpened wooden stakes driven into the foundation, locking it in place. As the walls rose, he threaded long wires through the bales, cinching them together from top to bottom, compressing the structure until it was a nearly monolithic mass of grass. The sheer thickness of the walls, nearly 3 feet deep, was astonishing. When standing inside the growing structure, the blustering prairie wind became a distant murmur, the harsh summer sun unable to penetrate the interior with its oppressive heat. The real genius, however, lay in the coating. Silas and Elara spent weeks digging clay from a nearby deposit, mixing it with sand, water, and lime to create a thick, durable plaster. They slathered it on by hand, covering every inch of the interior and exterior wall. The plaster filled every crevice between the bales, creating an airtight seal and, most importantly, a fireproof shield. The golden hay disappeared beneath a smooth, earthen skin that baked hard as rock in the sun. The house no longer looked like a haystack. It resembled an adobe structure from the distant southwest, an organic part of the landscape. They laid a thick roof of sod over heavy timber beams, and by the first frost of October, it was complete. Standing back to look at their creation, a low, solid, and utterly unique home, they felt a profound sense of accomplishment that dwarfed all the mockery they had endured. They moved their few possessions inside, and as the first true cold of winter began to seep into the land, they lit a fire in their new iron stove. The warmth it generated was held within the thick walls, creating a cozy, steady heat that their old sod dugout could never have dreamed of. As autumn bled into winter, the sky began to take on a leaden, ominous hue. And one afternoon, as Silas looked out their single glass window, he saw the first fat, heavy snowflakes begin to drift down. The low moan of the wind returned, and the world outside began to disappear into a swirl of white. The laughter of the town was long forgotten. The test had arrived. The first hours of the storm were a deceptive prelude. The snow fell in a thick, silent curtain, erasing the familiar lines of the prairie until the world outside their window was a formless swirl of gray and white. Inside, the silence was almost absolute, broken only by the soft crackle of the cottonwood in the stove and the rhythmic ticking of Elara's knitting needles. The thick, plastered walls of hay performed their duty with an uncanny efficiency, swallowing the rising shriek of the wind until it was a distant, toothless drone. But Silas was not at ease. He was a creature of the plains, and he could feel the character of this storm in his bones. This was not a passing squall. It was an invasion. He rose and went to the small, thick-paned window, rubbing a clear circle in the condensation. He could see nothing. The world had ceased to exist beyond the glass. It was as if their small home had been picked up and set down in the heart of a churning, white void. His thoughts turned to the cattle, his life's investment, huddled in the lean-to he had built against the northern wall of the cabin. The shared wall was part of his design, a hope that the warmth from the house would bleed through and offer the animals a small measure of comfort. He pulled on his heavy coat and boots. "I'm going to check them," he said, his voice low. Ilara nodded, her hands never ceasing their work. "Be quick. Don't let the beast in." He unbarred the heavy plank door. The instant the latch was free, the door was shoved inward with explosive force, as if a giant had kicked it. A blast of impossibly cold air and stinging, granular snow flooded the room, extinguishing the warmth from the stove in a heartbeat. The wind screamed into the insulated silence, a physical assault of sound and cold. For a moment, Silas fought against a solid wall of white, his breath stolen from his lungs. He finally forced the door shut, ramming the heavy wooden bar back into place. The tranquil quiet rushed back in, but the brief encounter had left its mark. The sheer, savage power of the storm was no longer an abstraction. It was real, and it was trying to claw its way inside. He felt a tremor of doubt, a cold snake in his gut. Was the plaster thick enough? Were the wires holding the bales tight enough? The laughter of the townspeople echoed in his memory, no longer a source of resolve, but a chorus of impending doom. He shook it off. Doubt was a luxury he couldn't afford. This house was all they had. By the second day, the world had shrunk to the four walls of their cabin. The wind no longer moaned, it shrieked, a constant, high-pitched keening that seemed to come from the throat of a tortured animal. The snow was no longer falling, but flying horizontally, a blinding, scouring torrent of ice crystals that sandblasted the outer plaster walls. The pressure inside the cabin changed, making their ears pop, as if they were descending into a deep mine. Time became fluid, measured only by the consumption of firewood and the slow creep of hunger. They ate biscuits and jerky, conserving their energy, speaking little. The stove was now the undeniable heart of their existence, a glowing deity of cast iron to which they paid constant tribute. Every log Silas placed inside was a prayer against the cold. He had stacked a formidable woodpile in the lean-to, but for the first time he wondered if it would be enough. The cold was a palpable entity, a physical weight pressing in on their sanctuary. The outer walls, facing the full onslaught of the north wind, were cold to the touch. The interior plaster rhymed with a thin layer of frost. Yet the air inside remained warm, a small bubble of life in a universe of absolute zero. From his omniscient perch, the narrator could see the terrible irony playing out across the territory. In Providence, Old Man Hemlock sat huddled in his general store, the wind whistling through the floorboards and rattling the window frames of his supposedly superior wood frame building. He had wrapped himself in wool blankets and was burning bacon crates to stay warm, the scent of his own dwindling profits turning to ash. Other families, in their drafty log homes and leaky soddies, fought a losing battle, stuffing rags into cracks as the wind stole their precious heat faster than they could generate it. For them, the storm was inside with them, a malevolent guest who refused to leave. For Silas and Ilara, it remained outside, a monster raging against impenetrable walls. Late that night, a tremendous thump shook the entire structure, followed by a deep groaning sound. Silas was on his feet in an instant, his heart hammering. Ilara gasped. "What was that?" she whispered. He grabbed the lantern, his face grim. "A drift, I think, collapsing against the west wall." He ran his hands along the interior plaster, feeling for any crack, any sign of strain. There was nothing. The house had groaned, but it had not yielded. It had taken the blow and stood firm, a testament to the strange, resilient power of grass. The third day brought the blizzard's apotheosis. The fury of the first 2 days seemed like a mere tantrum compared to the calculated, soul-crushing violence that now descended. The light outside dimmed to a permanent, featureless twilight, even at midday. The temperature, Silas guessed, must have been 40 below zero, a cold so profound it felt like it could shatter steel. It was in the depths of this frozen crucible that he heard it. At first he thought it was a trick of the wind, another voice in its hellish choir. But it came again, a high, frantic sound, thin and desperate, almost ripped to shreds by the gale. A horse. Somewhere out in that white chaos, an animal was screaming. He stood motionless, straining to hear, his blood turning to ice. The sound did not come again. It had been swallowed by the storm. He looked at Alara, whose face was a pale mask of horror. They both knew what it meant. Someone had been caught out in it. Someone had tried to ride through the storm and had failed. The knowledge settled upon them, a somber weight. Their home was not just a shelter, it was an ark, and the world outside was drowning in a frozen sea. The fate of that unseen rider reinforced the terrifying finality of their isolation. There was no help to be had, and none to be given. Their survival rested entirely on the integrity of their hay bale walls and the dwindling stack of firewood. A new urgency gripped Silas. He had to check the cattle again. He made the journey to the attached lean-to through the short, covered passage he'd built connecting the two structures. Pushing open the heavy interior door, he was met not with the storm's full fury, but with the warm, steamy air of breathing animals. The lean-to, buffered by the main house on one side and buried in a colossal snowdrift on the other, had become a surprisingly snug haven. His Hereford stock were on their feet, shifting placidly, their coats thick with frost but their bodies warm. The shared wall was radiating just enough heat, and their collective body warmth did the rest. They were safe. As he stood there, amidst the soft sound of their breathing and the sweet smell of hay, a profound sense of rightness washed over him. Every decision, every ridiculed choice had been validated. The land had provided the problem, and it had provided the solution. He had simply had the sense to listen. Later that evening, as the storm raged on, Alara began to softly sing an old hymn, her voice a fragile but defiant counterpoint to the wind's endless scream. It was a sound of hope in the heart of the tempest. When the end came, it was not with a sudden calm, but with a gradual, reluctant retreat. The shriek of the wind lessened, descending the scale back to a roar, then a moan, and finally a weary sigh. After 3 days of ceaseless, violent motion, the world outside fell utterly still. The silence that followed was immense, a ringing void that felt heavier and more profound than the noise it replaced. A strange, pale light began to filter through the window, growing in intensity until it was a painful, brilliant glare. For a full day they did not dare venture out, letting the sun begin its work on the mountains of snow. On the morning of the 5th day, Silas finally lifted the bar from the door. It wouldn't budge. He put his shoulder into it, pushing with all his might until it scraped open just enough for him to squeeze through. He stepped out into an alien landscape. He was standing in a narrow canyon of snow, the drifts piled up and sculpted by the wind into fantastic shapes, burying his house up to the eaves. The prairie was gone, replaced by a dazzling, undulating desert of white under a sky of piercing, indifferent blue. The air was so cold it burned his lungs, but it was clean and still. The sheer, terrifying beauty of the aftermath was breathtaking. He fashioned a pair of crude snowshoes from barrel staves and rope, and the next day set out for Providence. The 10-mile journey took him the entire day. The world was a graveyard. He saw the frozen, snow-dusted forms of cattle, their legs locked in a final, futile stance against the cold. He saw the top of a farmer's wagon, the rest buried, the oxen that had pulled it lying in their yokes, perfectly preserved statues of ice. As he neared the town, the signs of tragedy grew more frequent. When he finally walked down what he presumed was the main street, he saw houses half buried, their windows shattered. Faces, gaunt and grim, appeared in doorways. He he learned the terrible toll. The minister, a good man named John Miller, had frozen to death trying to get from his house to the church 50 yards away. 2 children from the Erickson family were lost, having wandered from their barn in the whiteout. He found old man Hemlock in his store. The place was a ruin, shelves overturned, a layer of snow covering everything. Hemlock sat by his cold stove, a blanket around his shoulders, his face gray with exhaustion and his fingers blackened by frostbite. He looked up as Silas entered, and the arrogance was gone from his eyes, replaced by a hollow, haunted look. "Blackwood," Hemlock rasped, his voice a dry crackle. Your house?" "We're fine," Silas said quietly. "Warm. The stock is alive." Hemlock stared at him for a long moment, the silence stretching between them. He finally gave a slow, deliberate nod, a gesture of profound defeat and grudging respect. "They called it Blackwood's Folly," the old man whispered. "We were the fools. We were the fools all along." In that moment there was no triumph for Silas, only a deep, somber sense of vindication that was as cold and stark as the landscape outside. In the weeks and months that followed the great blizzard of 1888, the stories of loss and survival became the new currency of the plains. But among the tales of tragedy, a new legend was born, the story of the rancher who built his house from grass and weathered the storm in comfort and safety. The name Blackwood's Folly was never spoken again. In its place, people began to call it the Hay Bale Ark. The ridicule Silas and Alara had endured transformed into a quiet, awestruck respect. Men who had once laughed openly at the sight of his walls now rode out to his claim, not to mock, but to learn. They came with hats in their hands and a humble curiosity in their eyes. Silas, a man of few words, would walk them around his simple, solid home, explaining the principles of compression, of the plaster coating, of orienting the structure to the wind. He shared his knowledge freely, seeing not the faces of his former tormentors, but the faces of fellow survivors who had been taught a brutal lesson by the land they all shared. The conventional wisdom of the prairie had been shattered, frozen to death in the wind. A new wisdom, born of observation and necessity, was beginning to take root. By the following autumn, 2 more hay bale houses were under construction in the territory, their builders following the methods Silas had pioneered. His legacy was not one of wealth or power, but of warmth and life. On a warm afternoon the following spring, as green shoots pushed their way through the thawing earth, Silas and Alara stood outside their home. The earth and plaster bore the scars of the winter, pitted and scoured by the wind, but the structure beneath was unharmed. It stood as a humble, undeniable monument to their shared vision and unwavering resolve. Alara leaned her head against his shoulder, looking out at the vast, healing prairie. They had faced the scorn of their community and the unbridled fury of nature, and they had not only survived, they had thrived. Their strange house of grass had become a true home, a sanctuary built not just of hay and plaster, but of courage, ingenuity, and a quiet, unshakable faith in one another.